Oh god, please don't tell me they're ripping off that one scene from Final Fantasy X. We open with Gyarados broadcasting some good old propaganda across the nations to warn them about the threat of the Sword Eyes of Light, who would be held off by the righteous hands of the Eyes of Darkness. You could have just gotten all of that across with one tweet, and then everyone would have believed you. It's sad that I'm only half kidding about that. The narrator, who I don't think we really brought up that much with the show, provides some very broad and yet intriguing world-building exposition, which, you know, is something a narrator normally should do. But yeah, he gives some interesting stuff through some useful color coding to explain how each of the nations had their own ruling parties and varying degrees of alliance with Atlantia. For instance, Kizakura's home continent of Megalian, that our protagonists were also on, had outright declined any foreign occupation until just recently. Yeah, these following episodes are going to be really political, which will lead to some more good bits of world building that will really help to flesh things out. You know, as opposed to barely showing one fantasy kingdom over the course of like 40 episodes. Anyone else miss the days of Mahotsukai? Meanwhile, our protagonists were having their own economic issues, with the Sweetsmates being overbooked with orders. Thus, Kizakura forced her new teammates to work for her. I mean, yeah, she was going to pay them, but come on, you can't just bring this on them out of nowhere there, girl. Anyway, during one of their deliveries, Tsurugi and Bringer almost ran over someone, but he was a clown, so it was no big deal really. Nah, of course, they helped him, and even took him back to the Sweetsmates, as allegedly he was both hungry and penniless, though more on the latter in just a sec. For now, Kizakura is looking through her fan mail after word had spread that she had defeated Hulk Hogan. Okay, I was just kidding earlier, but does social media actually exist in this fantasy world? But yeah, more importantly, this was meant to show how the people of her nation were supporting Kizakura's choice to directly oppose Atlantia, especially now that they were working towards annexing them. This of course then brought up the question of why the other nations were accepting Atlantia when the general consensus amongst all of the regular citizens across the nations was negative. Yeah, I've got nothing. That was just a really good line. And yeah, as it turned out, this old dude was in fact the king of Megalian, who was trying to learn more about his citizens by blending in amongst them. Granted, he could have chosen a better costume, but at least it would actually explain why a politician would try to run out on their bills. And he also did explain why they were even opening up talks with Atlantia. And not too surprisingly, it was mostly due to their nation's lack of essential resources that the largest continent could provide. Yeah, this was very basic social economics, and yet still very topical to this very day. And it was also one of the first major signs that this conflict wasn't quite as black and white as some might have thought. Things would turn even more gray when Queen Granada was going to arrive the next day as an ambassador for Atlantia, and seemingly was totally on Yaiba's side. The king suggested that amongst the plethora of superpowers Yaiba had already been using, one of them might have included brainwashing. And fortunately, he did have the full backing of his friends, including Suo, who just kind of flew in from out of nowhere. I mean, it did at least lead to a nice scene between the two, where they again discussed what a human is, and how both of these boys really didn't have parents, and thus didn't know what it was like to even have one. For Tsurugi, he was mostly just running under the impression that it would be good to have one, just like the impression that his brother was a complete evil tyrant. Which, yeah, about that, Tsurugi. The next day, Granada arrived in one of their country's airships, which, yeah, still looks like a football! Tsurugi and Bringer tried to rescue her, but it turned out to be a trap, as Yaiba was also there to confront them. He revealed that while he was gathering the Sword Eyes, his actual primary goal was to unite all of the nations under Atlantia. And all of this was with their mother's approval. From here, it was left ambiguous as to how much Granada was truly on Yaiba's side. Suo would confirm in the next episode, with his convenient homunculus powers, that she was under no mystical mind control, but Bringer would record her speech and eye patterns to likely process a crude lie detector test. Again, I really like how great things are turning out here, as while there is no magical brainwashing involved, you could say that some of the stuff going on with Granada here might be Stockholm Syndrome. I mean, no matter what, Yaiba was still her son, and as we'll soon see, he does bring up some good points, so it's understandable why, in spite of her better judgment, she would side with him. Regardless, Tsurugi was still in full-on shonen protagonist mode, so he did try to protect Megalian by banishing Atlantia from it, even though the king just said that they kind of needed their resources, so yeah, already 1 point to Yaiba there. Thus the brothers agreed to a battle under the condition that Atlantia's Stinger army would recede if Tsurugi won, and Megalian would likely still receive their trade benefits, but if Yaiba won, they would be allowed to fully annex the country. Again, card games on the Game of Thrones. Episode 12 ended with another sus moment with Gardos, and the start of the rematch between the princes of Atlantia. And because we don't want to just leave you all hanging, we're just gonna go right into the next episode. The brothers fought equally well for the most part, with Tsurugi even managing to play his new card that got a ton of build-up, the Flame Field. Sure enough, it worked exactly as needed to negate the Nine-Tailed Dark's bounce and tap effects. However, Yaiba had a weapon that was far more powerful than any Sword Brave and its card effect. That being the 3 words that no hero wants to hear out of the mouths of their villains. This was a common theme that the head writer of the show, Atsuhiro Tomioka, would include with a lot of his Battle Spirit seasons, including this and Shonen Gekiha Dawn. It's the idea that while the antagonists of their shows were indeed tyrants, they were tyrants with plans. I mean, sure, it's easy enough for any hero to step in and defend the common man, but what can they accomplish afterwards? Can they ensure a new evil won't arise even amongst the very people they just saved? Can they maintain the fragile stability of a nation and their finite resources? I mean, they certainly can try, but ultimately, not everything can be solved with just some basic and shallow heroic ideals. At times, people do have to commit morally questionable acts in order to ensure the greater peace. In this case, while Yaiba was essentially going to turn Megalian into another country with a massive social divide, he was also preventing it from collapsing in on itself due to a lack of food and other resources. This was further highlighted by the fact that ultimately, Tsurugi couldn't make any solid counter-arguments against his older brother, and instead could only express empty platitudes based on the opinions of just the common folk he had met and wasn't considering the larger picture. Now, of course, that's not to say what Tsurugi was doing by being more interpersonal was wrong. In fact, we'll go more over the pros and cons of both brothers by the end. For now, they had to play out the themes of the show through the card game, as while Tsurugi had accomplished his initial battle plan of just defeating the Nine-Tails Dark, when one Geats was defeated, another one could take its place. Yeah, apparently, in between their battles, Yaiba must have opened a few packs to get this new card. The Nega Nine-Tail, while having a higher normal summoning cost than the original, also had an effect that let it be summoned whenever a cost 6 or higher white spirit was destroyed like its original without paying that cost. It also had more attack that made it stronger than the Shining Dragon. Tsurugi tried to get around this by using another Flame Field as a power booster, but Yaiba said he wasn't looking at the big picture, and thus they think that he would also have a power boosting card.
Activate this card! Well, I activate this card!
With that, Yaiba used the Nega Nine-Tails effect that prevented it from being blocked, in combination with a spell that allowed it to restand and thus attack twice for game. While all of this was going on, the other Eyes of Light tried to rescue Granada, and as I said, Suo confirmed that she wasn't under any spell. She did, however, let them go free with Tsurugi under the context that they were being exiled from the country. Yaiba agreed to these terms, likely so that the protagonist could go find the remaining eyes for him, but yeah, this is just adding more to the queen's ambiguity. Regardless, this is still a huge loss for them, as not only was the king forced to submit to Atlantia after trusting in Tsurugi, but Kizakura was forced to resign from her position as the president of the Sweets Mates since she couldn't live in her own country anymore. Still, her employees assured her that they just have a temp president until she could return, in a nice moment that also helped to highlight the unity between the Eyes of Light, while on Yaiba's side, Aizen was getting ready for his next move. And with that, the episode ended with our heroes heading back to Tsurugi's hometown to rejuvenate and think about their next course of action. This was just a great and well-written two-parter to close out the first core of this series. It had a lot of good character moments, some decent twists, and had some strong theming around what it truly means to be a savior of the people. Yes, this again features Tsurugi losing to Yaiba, but I really don't mind it when the main hero loses to the rival as long as there's a good reason behind it. One thing I really like in my hero shows, be it for tokusatsu, magical girls, or card games, is when the hero isn't automatically portrayed to be in the right. Sure, the principles should be proven right in the end, but that doesn't mean that they can't be questioned and adjusted a little. In this case, they really played up the idea that the evil overlord of this story might have a bit of a point. Yaiba was considering what nations like Megaleon needed to survive, even if it wasn't necessarily what the people wanted. Without Atlantea's intervention, it really was only a matter of time before the nation ran out of natural resources. Though, that's not to say that Tsurugi was wrong in his approach either. By being more personable, he not only had a better understanding of how the people felt, but he also was able to maintain a close group of friends and allies who, even in spite of his loss that did affect some of them, were there to help him up. Meanwhile, Yaiba's court had a bunch of bickering children and a very obvious Judas. The elder brother may have been looking at the big picture, but the younger one was looking at the smaller, yet still very significant little details. In that sense, with this loss, Tsurugi did gain the awareness they need to start looking at things differently. Meanwhile, Yaiba only gained more reassurance to maintain a tunnel vision that led to the downfall of kings like Arthur, who didn't even consider that his own knights might betray him before it was too late. It's a well thought out hero story that took full advantage of this fantasy setting by integrating some clear, yet not intrusive real life geopolitics to highlight how things aren't just gonna be all that black and white. I mean, Gyarados was definitely more on the dark side, as we'll even see next time, but for the main rivalry of the show, they need to start meeting in the middle to really start to figure things out. And it all made for overall really good closure to the first core of the series with a great battle and even better storytelling. While I definitely don't think everything has to be political, especially nowadays, if you can make it interesting with color-changing foxes, then you at least have my attention. Work on the Max Heart review is going about as well as it could, I guess. I mean, I think the script writing process for this one has been a little easier, but maybe that's because there's just not that much to talk about compared to the first season. I guess make of that what you will. Still, do look forward to it. Until then, though, for now, my friends, and okay, if you're a real clown, honk once. If you're not, honk twice. Good to know.